So tonight we are going to introduce the basics of paleontology, and then we're going to talk about dinosaurs and the paleontology of dinosaurs and its history. So we'll go over these two lectures tonight. There are things in here that I promise you will be on the test, so you can pay attention to some of this stuff and see if you can commit it to memory. Remember, I like learning by repetition. To me, that's the most fun way of learning. It's the easiest way. And so I repeat things so that you can hear them again and again. All right, we're going to talk about what a fossil is, how taphonomy works, what is taphonomy, and how it works. Fossil comes from the Latin fossilium, which means something dug up. Something dug up. So fossil means something that was dug out of the ground. So what is a fossil? Well, is it Fido's bone in the backyard? Probably not, but technically yes, because when Fido digs up the bone, that then qualifies as a fossil. It is the only physical evidence we have of organisms that are no longer around today. The only direct data for knowledge about life in the past is through the digging up of the remains of organisms that were alive in the past. So when we work in the quarries, we are generating fossils. They aren't fossils in the ground. They are fossils when they are dug up. Vertebrate paleontology is a subset of paleontology. Paleontology includes invertebrate paleontology, it includes microfossil paleontology, and it includes plant paleontology, paleobotany. So all these things are encompassed in paleontology, but we're specifically concerned about vertebrate paleontology here, the study of ancient animals or animals in the past that had backbones, and this includes dinosaurs. So what kinds of fossils of dinosaurs do we find? We find isolated bones and teeth. Have any of you found isolated bones and teeth? Okay, good. We find skeletons in varying degrees of completeness, and we have found some of those in some of the quarries. We also find footprints and trackways. Well, we haven't found footprints and trackways here on this ranch, but on the next ranch over, the Zerps Ranch, there is a place where there is a display of footprints and trackways of dinosaurs. It's very difficult to find. It's on private property, and over the years, the footprints have gotten dimmer and dimmer. But you could see those in the museum in Hill City, in the Black Hills Institute. They have a cast of those footprints from over here on the Zerps Ranch in the museum there on display. You can also find skin impressions and feathers. Feathers, if feathers belong to dinosaurs, which is still a point of contention. But skin impressions have been found, and on Zerps Ranch, they found a Triceratops, which had most of the skin impressions still there. And it looked like, from what I saw, it looked like they have a belly much like a snake with plates that go all the way across the belly. And then the sides had this elaborate ornamentation like we'll see in the picture in a minute. There are some cases where people have claimed to find mineralized soft tissue, things like muscles, intestines, and in one case of the hadrosaur, they actually talked about having found a heart in the animal, which turned out later on to be probably not a heart. Then there are eggs, and some of these eggs have embryos in them, and there are some eggs that are even arranged in nests. And this caused people trepidation who are creationists, because it takes time to lay your eggs in the nest because they're very carefully arranged. They aren't just tossed in there. Clearly, they had to rotate their body about to lay the eggs in a very ornate arrangement in the nest. But how much time? An hour, a day? I don't know. We don't know, but certainly not a year. There also are coprolites, which are fossilized feces, and these are lots of fun, and you do occasionally find those here. So this is a diagram just going over what I told you. Skin impressions, skeletons, eggs, footprints, fossilized feces. All these different representations are called fossils. They are things that are dug up that represent the animal when it was around. Here's an illustration of some hadrosaur skin, and this is typical of dinosaur skin. They tend to have areas that are uniform and then pockets of material which is not uniform. Yes?
I'm not sure I understood well, but you told that all of the layers here was deposited during the flood, but now you said we can find track fossils or track holes. So what's the reason of that? There was some kind of pause during the deposition? Or?
Well, in these dinosaurs that we find on the ranch, we find an assortment of teeth of theropods mixed in with them. Those teeth of the theropods clearly came about as a result of them having scavenged on these dead dinosaurs. So the dinosaurs died, the massive dinosaurs that we have here on the ranch, they died. They probably floated and bloated and floated onto a shoreline, and while they were on the shoreline, they were scavenged by the still living theropods. And those theropods came there because there was a meal. Those theropods were walking around still. Eventually, those theropods were also killed, and they joined the milieu. But that would have been somewhat later. I don't know how much later, but clearly these dinosaurs died long before they were buried, long enough so that the bones could disarticulate. So the flood was not a process that took place in a day or a week or a month, but it took about a year, which is plenty of time for the bones to be rotted. But everything didn't die at once. And probably the last things to die are going to be the hardest to find because they would have been closest to the surface. And that may explain why it is we don't find, for example, human remains of men from before the flood, because they would have been the ones to escape being the most intelligent. They would have been the ones to escape to the highest ground and would have been the last to die and therefore the first to be disintegrated. Whereas these animals may have already been buried. So here you can see that the skin is not uniform. It would have been very interesting to look at. You see these little pockets of larger scales among the smaller scales. Yes?
How were those impressions made?
This is, of course, this is a cast of a mold that was made from probably a mudstone or sandstone impression of that skin. So the skin was still on the animal got buried, the skin left an impression in the stone, and then when they uncovered the fossil, they found that stone and made a cast of it. Here, for example, is a hadrosaur. It doesn't, as far as I know, it doesn't have skin on it, but you can see where all the muscles were, all the bones are still in place. These are called mummified dinosaurs, which really doesn't mean very much except that they're all together. That stuff that looks like it might be muscle tissue there, that's rock. You know, so you're not really looking at technically you're not really looking at a fossil, but you're looking at an animal that's still all together. So these are called mummies. And most of the ones we find are hadrosaurs, Edmontosaurus, and there are a few also Lambeosaurus and so on. Yes?
How in desert areas, oftentimes changing temperatures vary a lot, and with all the wind and other conditions, how are these animals able to become mummified for so long?
These probably weren't mummified. They were probably just died and got buried very quickly so that their bodies still together. We call them mummies, not because they dried out, but because they were buried quickly and the body's still all there. And it looks as if the tissues are still holding things together. So when an animal dies, it can be buried quickly, and if it's buried quickly, it still maintains its integrity as a fossil, and this kind of animal would still have its skin on, and it might impress that skin into the surrounding sediments. Over time, this could degenerate, or it could stay relatively intact. Eventually, it gets eroded out, and somebody sees it, and they find a dinosaur. The other thing that can happen is it can sit around long enough for decay to take place, disarticulation of the specimen, and this would result in the redistribution of the parts, and so we might just find an isolated bone. Those are two extreme methods of obtaining fossils. Most are going to be somewhere in between, yes.
What's the composition of the bones here? Do you have a
Calcium phosphate, just like our bones today, they would have been white. They would have, when they were buried, they would have been white. And then when they are buried, part of the taphonomist's job is to find out what kinds of changes took place in those bones that made them this beautiful mahogany color that bones are today. That's a result of the impregnation of the bone, the original calcium phosphate, with minerals, oftentimes iron and manganese and some fluorine. So you get calcium fluorapatite, which is very hard. So these bones actually are harder now than they were when they were alive because they have some fluorine with the bone structure. But the color change is a result of picking up minerals from the surrounding rock. There also is blood in the bones, and the blood has iron in it, and that iron can come out of the blood. And there's sulfur in there from the amino acids, and that sulfur can combine with the iron and make ferric sulfate, which is pyrite. And so you can have pyrite deposited in the marrow cavities of some of the bones. We find that occasionally. Not too often, and that's a good thing, because what happens is the pyrite gets what's called pyrite sickness, and it causes, as it degenerates, it increases in volume and swells and breaks the bones apart. Yes?
So why is it that theropod bones are black relatively compared to the other bones?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Why are they what?
Why are theropod bones black, even though they're deposited in the same?
Well, they're not black. They are also darkly colored, like the non-theropod bones. The difference is not in the color, it's in the fact that the theropod bones are hollow. And because they're hollow, all the strength of the bone has to be in the outside, and so the outside is very dense. So it's a lot more like a tooth, the surface, the enamel on a tooth. It would not be very porous. And so it would take up minerals differently than, say, a hadrosaur bone, which has the internal marrow cavity full of marrow, and that would be what you're finding in the quarries mostly. When you see a theropod bone, what you notice about it is it seems to be very dense, very like enamel on a tooth. It's almost has no porosity to it at all. Whereas a hadrosaur bone has a lot of porosity and looks like it could easily be penetrated by water. It probably can't be, but it looks like it. And you had a question? Yes.
the chemical composition of these fossils are the same in different quarries, or?
You know, we haven't looked at that. That's one of the things we can look at later, because you can take a sample of the bone and have it analyzed. But it's mostly calcium phosphate and calcium fluorapatite. That's calcium phosphate with fluorine substitute for some of the calcium, or for some of the phosphate. And that part is unique. That's the same everywhere. We have looked at some cross sections of these bones in thin section, where we cut a very thin section of the bone where you can see through it. And we can see the original cell structure inside the bones. including the nucleus of the cells. So you can see where the osteocytes are. They're in the osteons, and you can see every osteon, every osteocyte is all just like it was fresh bone. And I used to teach a course in histology, which is a study of tissues, and that's one of the things we studied a lot was thin sections of various tissues, including bone. And so I would teach students about modern bone using modern bone slides, but I could have used the fossil ones because they look just the same. All right, let's study now about taphonomy. Taphonomy is the law of taphos, which means burial, the law of burial. Taphonomic research includes what the animal was doing when it died. Was it out grazing in a field? Was it fleeing? Was it swimming? What was it doing when it died? What caused it to die? What happened after it died? How long did it lie around? Was it buried quickly, or did it get transported? And then what happened when it was buried? And then what kinds of changes took place after it was buried? All of that is encompassed in the science of taphonomy. Taphonomy is a very big deal in crime scene investigation, where you want to know when a body was, when a corpse you find out in the woods, you want to know how long ago that person died. So taphonomists are the kind of people that, modern taphonomists are the kind of people that try to figure out what it was that happened to this animal or this person. Why did they die, and then how long ago did they die, and under what circumstances. So all of this stuff comes out of the study of taphonomy. So we're just modern, we're just ancient taphonomists. We work on fossils instead of modern organisms, but the questions we ask and the answers we seek are very similar. For example, here are some data. Here's a rib. This is a astragalus there, or calcaneum, I guess. That's a calcaneum, and this is a rib. This came from just south of South Quarry in the wall. Those are the kinds of fossils that you'll find in the quarries. And bones are the data. Those are the data that we have. Bones in the surrounding sediment give us our data so that we can ask questions. So that's what you're going to look for. All right, now we're going to talk about the dinosaur explorers, the people that sought to know about dinosaurs. And where did the idea of a dinosaur ever come from? In 1800, there was no such thing as a dinosaur. Nobody had really picked up on the idea of dinosaurs very much until the late 1700s and the early 1800s. So we're going to talk about the origin of the dinosaur concept, some of the first discoveries of dinosaurs, and then the great dinosaur wars, the bone wars, so-called bone wars, and then we'll talk about some modern dinosaur hunters. So let's talk a little about science. We're out here doing science. Science is a way of understanding the physical universe. It's a set of tools by which we explore the world. We try to figure out a cause from an effect by using the hypothesis and testing a hypothesis. So we look at things in nature, we make observations, we think of possible explanations for those observations, and those observations have to be testable. We say they have to be falsifiable. If you can't think of something that would make an idea false, then it's not a good idea. It's not a scientific, well, maybe a perfectly good idea. It's just not a scientific idea, because in science it has to be testable. When you test the hypothesis, up until then it's speculation. After you test it, then you can bring it into the realm of science and talk about it in the scientific context. If a hypothesis survives these tests of falsification, it can be tentatively or provisionally accepted, keeping in mind that Science is always tentative, and it can always change. And I could cite numerous examples in my own experience where things that I was taught were true as a graduate student are no longer believed to be true. And this is an example of how science progresses. It doesn't mean science is bad. It means science is always tentative. And anybody that tells you that anything is proven beyond a shadow of doubt, and oftentimes when you hear those words used, it's with the idea of evolution, is proved beyond the shadow of a doubt. Evolution is not even a good hypothesis, saying nothing of being proved by anybody at any level. So just be very careful when somebody says something's proven in science. It means they don't understand science, because a scientist never uses the word prove. Proven is not a word in science. It's a word in mathematics. You can use it in logic. You can use it in mathematics. But science, it's forbidden to use the word proof. So when 21 Nobel laureates sign a statement saying that evolution is true, you know that they may be very intelligent people, but they aren't informed about some things, because they would never put their name to that if they had understood science correctly. Once an idea has been tested and tested and tested, eventually it may be called a theory. So we have the theory of evolution. Has the theory of evolution been tested and tested and tested? No. People have used the theory of evolution to describe lots of experiments, but has anybody ever tested it to see if it's true? If they did, they'd have to be able to falsify it. They'd have to have an observation that could disprove it. And typically what you find is no matter what the outcome of a study is, no matter what the results of the author are, he can couch it easily within the realm of evolution. So papers often on any subject in science often will have a paragraph at the end talking about how this applies to the theory of evolution. It doesn't mean that it proves evolution. It means they accept evolution as a fact, and they try to couch their findings within the domain of evolution. So watch for that. Another thing you see that's very similar is scientists will study some eclectic view or some eclectic chemical, and then at the end of the paper they'll say, this has potential use in curing cancer. That's what the biochemical equivalent of evolution is cancer. So papers will have one of those two messages at the end. Either this is showing something more about evolution, or this is something with the potential to cure cancer. And that makes sure that they get funding next time around. When a scientist has tested his ideas or her ideas, the next thing you have to do is publish it in a peer-reviewed journal. So right now, Dr. Snyder and I are writing a paper on the dig site. And our goal is to get this published in a scientific publication. Sometimes it's very difficult, not because of the subject matter, but because people will know who we are. And they will reject ideas out of hand because they know we're creationists. And I recently had this happen with a paper that I submitted to a journal, and it came back without even having gone out for review because the editors themselves knew that I was a creationist. And they just shipped it back to me and said, we don't want your paper. But I've resubmitted it to another journal, and we'll see what happens. But that is a problem we have sometimes to work with. All right, dinosaurs in prehistory. There are lots and lots of stories in every culture about things called dragons. Every culture has dragons. European culture has dragons. Asian culture has dragons. African culture has dragons. Everybody has dragons in their culture. That's pretty phenomenal. Why would cultures have something as strange as that? Well, people long ago probably began to think about giant animals, and perhaps stories came down from those who lived before the flood about dinosaurs. For example, you may not have known this, but Noah was still alive on the earth when Abraham was alive. So he could have told a lot of things, probably indirectly, to Abraham. So there were people around on the earth for many, many years after the flood that would have known about dinosaurs. And it's possible that those stories were passed down through various cultures. Also, the Bible talks about dragons, doesn't it? And attributes the characteristics of a dragon to none other than Satan himself. But people saw trackways on the ground of these giant animals. They saw big bones. They probably didn't know what those were. In fact, oftentimes they called those the bones of giant humans. There must have been giant humans around because look at these big femora. So those kinds of ideas probably were around for maybe thousands of years. We don't know. Here's an example of some tracks. These were called the tracks of Noah's raven. Why does that? Why would they be Noah's raven? What's Noah's raven? Well, they're made in mud. They look like a bird track. And Noah sent a raven out, didn't he? And the raven didn't come back, so it must have been walking around in the mud somewhere sometime. And so it left these tracks. The word dinosaur came into existence in 1842. So if you lived before 1842, you would not have known what to do with bones that we're finding on the ranch. You would have had to say, we don't know what it is. But Sir Richard Owen, who was a creationist, coined that term in 1842. He was a very famous scientist. He was known as the Aristotle of the 18th century, 19th century, and he was well respected. And the fact that he was a creationist grated on some people who were espousing evolution. The Greek word dinos means fearfully great, not just big, but wonderfully big, and sauros means lizard. So a great big lizard, that's what dinosaur means. A dinosaur is an archosaur. An archosaur is a group of reptiles that include crocodiles and dinosaurs and turtles and things like that, with upright limbs. So its limbs were underneath its body, not out to the side like other reptiles, but underneath the body. They had 3 or more sacral vertebrae fused together, and they had a perforate acetabulum, which you can see here. Here's the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. There's a pubis here, ischium, ilium, and that's the acetabulum right there. Perforate acetabula is the only characteristic that's unique to dinosaurs. No other animals have it, and all dinosaurs have it. So if you want to know if something's a dinosaur or a bird, look at the acetabulum. You can tell. The early concepts of dinosaurs came from some fossils that were found in the 1700s. The earliest of these was published in a book, Robert Plo's Natural History of Oxfordshire, published in 1677. He called it Capita femoris inferiora, or part of the thigh bone. He thought it was from an elephant because the Romans had come to England and had brought elephants with them. So that's what he assumed it was because it was so large. In 1728, posthumous catalog of the geologic collection of John Woodward showed a portion of a dinosaur limb bone. That's the earliest discovered dinosaur bone that is still accounted for. It's labeled and in a museum collection. Several other discoveries, but most of what we now know are dinosaur bones, but they were lost or were not formally published. The first major published dinosaur discovery was in Britain by Reverend William Buckline in 1824 of what he called Megalosaurus, this big lizard, something that might have been 40 feet long. He thought it was like a monitor lizard, just a lizard, nothing more, just a big lizard. And here is a depiction of what that Megalosaurus, he thought it looked like. Next major discovery in the wild region of southern England by Dr. Gideon and Mary Ann Mantell. Their story is quite interesting. Gideon Mantell was a physician, and back in those days, physicians didn't live in the office and people come to them. They went to people who were sick, which makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? If somebody's sick, they need you to fix them. They don't feel like getting up and coming into the hospital, so the doctor would go to them. The teeth were leaf-shaped, looked like a modern iguana. He called it iguanodon, iguano teeth. Formerly described in 1825, he again thought it was a giant iguana. Here's what the tooth looked like, very similar to hadrosaur teeth. Here's a picture of Gideon and Mary Ann Mantell. He was a man obsessed. According to the myth, Mary Ann traveled with him when he went out on his house calls. While he saw patients, Mary Ann rummaged around nearby streams and quarries looking for fossils. That's the story that he put out. I think probably it's not true. I think probably he wished it was true. Mary Ann is at home taking care of the children, and Gideon's off looking around in the gravel trying to find fossils. That would be more true to the story as it turns out. So the story is that in 1821 she found some large reptile teeth in a pile of roadside gravel. The road workers showed her the quarry where they dug the gravel. They raced back to the quarry, found some more teeth and bone fragments. Gideon scoured the museums looking for clues about the fossil. There's some probability that Gideon invented the story. Why? Because he was late getting home. His wife was worried about him. She got really mad when he got home, and he said, "Look what we found. I'll put you into the story if you'll just accept the fact that I love to do this." And it probably didn't work out too well because eventually they divorced, and Gideon died broken and poor man. But anyway, here is the story. Here are the things they found. A piece of jaw. In 1840, he found iguanodon. He called it the Maidstone iguanodon. And here are the bones that he actually found. This is the backbone. This is part of the tail. And he found this one thing that looked like a horn. And it turns out that was not really a horn, it was a thumb. So he drew it wrong, and it stayed that way for a long time. Here's what the iguanodon actually looks like. They are quite large animals, very similar to the hadrosaurs that we work on here. And if anybody ever tells you that they're just making up stuff about dinosaurs, they don't really know what they look like. They just find a little bone, and then they try to make the whole animal out of that one bone. There were 39 of these whole animals taken out of a coal mine. Apparently they got buried, drowned and buried with the plant material. And so they were covered with carbon and very well preserved. And when they took them out, they had them all intact. There are many, many more of this in that coal mine, but the coal mine's been shut down and nobody can get into it today. I think it's actually underwater. So Gilbert sent his report to the Royal Society of London and published it in 1825. Here is the actual title and the heading of it. And you can see they use very flowery language that would be off-putting to us today. And people would wonder why we wrote in such a stilted style. But that was typical of the kind of writing that they did back then. Here's the iguanodon as it's depicted. Notice this is an early picture because it still has the horn on its nose. This is a little later, more refined picture. Notice it has 5 fingers, and one of those is that big claw. Third major discovery, also by Mantels, was another dinosaur that was a carnivorous dinosaur, and it was called Hyalosaurus. It had large spikes along the skeleton, and this is how it's depicted. Still, notice, class Reptilia, order Sauria, the lizards. 1836, Edward Hitchcock, president of Amherst College. Where's Amherst College? Massachusetts. Reported on the discovery of what he believed to be the tracks of giant birds. The largest of these earliest footprints was a large cast of a 3-toed track he named Ornithicnides giganteus. And here's what it looked like down here. He thought it was a track of a bird. Later on, it was renamed Eubrontes giganteus. It's the first dinosaur track to be described anywhere. Hitchcock got into a dispute with a friend of his, James Dean. By the way, getting into disputes with friends is not a good idea, because look what it says here. Former friend. Okay, so their friendship dissolved because they disputed over the significance of the tracks. Some of them thought they were bird tracks, some of them thought they were something else, and so they got into a dispute and ended up parting ways, and for the rest of their lives. Same thing with Cope and Marsh, that we'll get to in a minute. 1865, the year he died, Hitchcock had named hundreds of species of footprints. Based on the resemblance to the tracks of birds, he remained true to his idea that most of them were made by birds. However, he also recognized that some of them had, in addition to bird-like feet, 5-fingered hands. They could not have been made by birds. There must be some kind of a reptile that's like a bird, or maybe a marsupial like a kangaroo. Ironically, fragmentary bones of real dinosaurs had been described 16 years earlier by Ellsworth, and he thought they were human. 1841, Sir Richard Owen brought sensibility to the whole story of dinosaurs by naming them dinosaurs, putting them all into another group outside of the other reptiles called Dinosauria. Here's what he said. In combination of such characters, some, such as the sacral ones, that is, they had a sacral vertebrae fused together, also peculiar among reptiles, others borrowed, as it were, from a group now distinct from each other, and all manifested by creatures far surpassing in size the largest living reptiles. It is presumed be deemed sufficient ground for establishing a distinct tribe or suborder of saurian reptiles, for which I would propose the name Dinosauria. Of this tribe, the principal and best established general are Megalosaurus and Hylosaurus and Iguanodon. So there is the description of the Dinosauria. Interestingly, Ellen White speaks in one place about a order of animals before the flood, much larger than anything we have today. In 1851, 1852 in Hyde Park, they had a world exhibition, World Fair, and Owen and Hawkins were commissioned to produce life-size outdoor diorama of the dinosaurs. So they built these models of cement, and they had an iguanodon there on exhibit, and they had a dinner party inside the model of the iguanodon. Dinosaurs were now a big deal. Here are some depictions of the dinosaurs at the World Fair. It was a big deal. In North America, dinosaur teeth were found by explorers in the Western Territories, right up above us in Montana in 1856 by Joseph Leidy. He recognized some to be similar to iguanodon, others similar to megalosaur, still others some sort of lizard. He named them Dinodon and Trachodon. Then back in New Jersey, Leidy again named it the dinosaur that had been found there. He named it Hadrosaurus. Even though it was very similar to iguanodon, it was a more complete fossil than any of the iguanodons, so he was able to say more about it than people knew up until that time. And he revolutionized the depiction of dinosaurs because up until that time, people had assumed they were lizards and put them down on all 4 feet. Now that he had more complete data, he could say these are not obligate quadrupeds. So here's his depiction of Hadrosaurus there. Here's one of the femora. And look at this picture by Waterhouse Hawkins showing iguanodon and several other dinosaurs. Here Megalosaurus is biting them, and so here's some sheepishly walking off, maybe on their way to a party or something. Then in 1878 they found these dinosaurs in a coal mine in Bernissart in Belgium. 37 of them were eventually taken out of there. They were described in detail in 1882. They figured out that spike that Mantell had put on the nose really went on the hand. Then we had the great dinosaur rush. These two guys were responsible. They started out friends, working together. Then they became jealous of one another. And then they became fighters, and they fought each other throughout their whole lives, trying to see who could get the most claim, the most credit, the most fame for their work. We don't need to go into all the details, except to say that they had a lot of incidents between them where one guy would hire the other one's workers and would run off with them and try to get ahead. Each one tried to get ahead of the other. And even though Cope had a lot of money to begin with, he ended up with very little money. And he used up all his money in this war with Marsh. Marsh effectively had deep pockets, and Cope used up all his money in these fights. Notice he's a nephew of the Peabodys, who built the Peabody Museum and other things, and had very deep pockets. So eventually what happened was Cope ran out of money. His family broke up. He borrowed money. He sold off all his fossils, all his fossil collections, which was like pulling teeth for him because he loved every one of those fossils. But he had to sell them in order to stay in business. And he lost his house. He lost all his property. And still he kept on trying to dig more fossils up. And these guys published madly. I think he published over 1,000 scientific publications in his lifetime. Between 1870 and the late 1890s, Cope and Marsh identified 136 new dinosaur species and many, many other animals, mammals, fish, and birds, all from fossils. As I said, they began as friends. Marsh went on an expedition, went to Kansas, Utah, and Wyoming. Cope went out and tried to look in Wyoming, and Marsh said, "You're in my territory, get out of here," and that's how it started. So then Cope would hire Marsh's chief guy, and he'd come over to Cope and tell him all the stuff about Marsh. So Marsh would hire Cope's chief guy, learn everything he could, and this just went on and on for years. Cope worked in many fossil sites. He was better at getting quality specimens because the rock was softer, like our rock here. Marsh worked at Como Bluff. It was mostly Jurassic period dinosaurs, so he found Brontosaurus, the big long-necked one there, and all that story came out of Marsh's work. In January 1890, the New York Herald ran a series of articles about the two men. It was actually precipitated by Cope, who wanted to undo Marsh by revealing some of his more unsavory characteristics, but the newspaper was too hot on this issue to just show one side, so they went for both sides. So they said Cope was unable to properly classify and name the fossils his explorers secured. Marsh employed assistants who did the work for him, to which he signed his name. The most remarkable collection of errors and ignorance of anatomy and literature on the subject ever displayed. That's what Cope said about Marsh. Here's what Marsh said about Cope. Cope's mental and moral characteristics unfit him for any position of trust and responsibility. He is inordinately jealous and suspicious, traits that give him that hysterical temper. They did have their failures. Cope assembled and wrote about Elasmosaurus. Marsh examined the skeleton and found that Cope had gotten the tail and neck on the wrong ends. Can you imagine how embarrassing that would be? Marsh was asked to resign from the U.S. Geological Survey due to congressional budget cuts. Some congressmen saw his work as such a waste, they began referring to government waste as birds without teeth after Marsh's book on extinct birds. So they both had their degrees of humility. Coprolite, named by Marsh for his arch rival, according to folklore. But actually it was named in 1830 by William Buckland. This is way before the bone wars, from the Greek word kopros, which means dung, and ite meaning a mineral, so fossil dung. So even though it sounds right, it's not true. After the era of Cope and Marsh, both of them died. Cope died at a fairly young age of some kind of consumption. Nobody really knows what it was. We had expeditions to Asia in the 1920s. In the early 1900s, an expedition to Tendaguru in Africa, now Tanzania. And this is a very interesting thing because you never would expect to find dinosaurs in Africa because most of Africa is tropical. So you have lots of rainfall. Lots of rainfall means lots of green stuff, and the green stuff covers the rocks, and the rocks are where the dinosaur bones are. So it's very difficult to find anything there in the first place. But somebody did, and they found dinosaurs there, and they took them back to Germany. Some of them made it to Germany. Some of them were destroyed in World War I, and some of them were on a boat that was being transported to Germany when it sunk. Lots of other expeditions we could go through. 1960s, jumping ahead, John Ostrom of Yale University reinterpreted horned and duck-billed dinosaurs as being sophisticated feeders. That's what I told you when we talked about the ornithischian dinosaurs. Their chewing apparatus is the most sophisticated of any animal. In 1964, he found Deinonychus, the sickle-like claw in the foot, and he suggested this was used for ripping out the guts of its enemies or its prey. Other people have since suggested that this was used for climbing trees. And I was at a meeting, well, I guess I wasn't there, but Dr. Spencer was at a meeting in Berkeley maybe 15 years ago, and they invited a keynote speaker from Russia. And the keynote speaker brought with him a representation of Deinonychus climbing a tree. Okay, so here's this animal with this sickle-shaped claw that's used to rip out the guts of its enemy, and he's showing it being used to climb trees. And that was so unpopular with the other scientists that they were so rude to him, they never even went up on the stage to introduce him or to say anything nice, because he had the gall to suggest that Deinonychus didn't use its sickle-shaped claw to rip out the guts of its enemies. In the 1970s began a renaissance of dinosaurs. The questions were they cold-blooded or warm-blooded? And the two main protagonists, or antagonists I should say, were Bob Bacher and Jack Horner. And they both, we'll say a little bit about them later on. But it's pretty clear that if Bob Bacher said they were cold-blooded, Jack Horner would say they're warm-blooded. It's the same kind of rivalry that we saw in the earlier bone wars. They talked about, did they have a complex family structure? How did they communicate? How are they related? And the relationship to birds. And new discoveries were made in many parts of the world after 1970. Here's pictures of Jack Horner, Bob Bacher, and Larry Turner, the co-director of the Hansen Research Station here in Wyoming. So Jack Horner is curator of the Museum of the Rockies. He's now retired. Bob Bacher was curator of the University of Colorado Museum in Boulder, and then after that, the University of Houston, the Houston Museum of Natural History, and Larry Turner is director of this project. Jack Horner didn't finish high school. He flunked out of college. He is widely known as the leader of destroying the T-Rex reputation as a savage predator. He said T-Rex was more likely to be a scavenger for various reasons. And of course, in this community, saying T-Rex is a scavenger is just not going to fly, because every kid in the block wants T-Rex to be this fierce predator. So if somebody comes along and says, nah, he ate dead animals, that's like a buzzard. Nobody would have a vulture for a pet. And that's the same thing here with Jack Horner. Bob Bacher got his undergraduate at Harvard, his PhD from Yale. He's known as being an unconventional scientist. He loves talking to kids. He is very easy to get along with. He tries to make dinosaurs interesting to children. He was consulted on Jurassic Park. He obviously sees T-Rex as a predator. Larry Turner, PhD, University of Michigan in astrophysics, known for being unconventional. He says the first duty of scientists is to spread knowledge of Jesus Christ to as many people as possible, not to talk above people and write in scientific jargon. And he didn't consult Jurassic Park, but he would have if he'd been asked. All right, thank you very much.